Oren, welcome to Hub Dialogues, and thanks for joining us here in Canada.
Thank you for allowing me in.
We have a lot to talk about today with respect to Trump's provocations towards Canada, what to make of them, and what you think Canadian policymakers ought to do in response. But before we get there, I thought I might take up some of the topics we discussed last night at our well-attended event in Ottawa, where amongst other subjects, we talked a bit about American Compass, the organization that you founded, and its understanding of political economy and how it might contrast with conventional conservative economic orthodoxy. And I wanted to start there, if that's okay. The Trump administration, of course, not just through these tariff measures, but in a whole host of other areas, is breaking with the conventional Republican playbook when it comes to political economy. I think it's fair to say you and American Compass have had an influence in those developments. So how would you characterize American Compass's conception of political economy, and how does it differ from what has come in the past with respect to conservative economic orthodoxy?
Sure. Well, I think, what I would say the starting point is I would describe what we are doing at American Compass as much more conventional conservative economics in the broader sense. What we call conservative economics, certainly in the U.S., is this kind of Reagan and post-Reagan phenomenon where if you stop someone on the street and ask them, what do conservatives think would be, tax cuts, free trade, deregulation, maybe some light union busting mixed in. But that was itself a break from a much longer running orthodoxy, that had defined the Republican Party as the party of tariffs, for instance, going all the way back to Abraham Lincoln, that had made the U.S. a country that focused on very robust national economic policy, industrial policy, trade protection, all the way back to Alexander Hamilton and the founding. And so what I think you see in the Reagan era, and even more so in the aftermath and sort of the misinterpretation of the Reagan era, is a situation where the right of center coalition in the United States brought in a lot of libertarians and gave them extraordinary power over what right of center economic policy was going to be. And it became what I would call a quite severe market fundamentalism, built around two premises that we reject. One, that essentially consumer welfare is all that matters, that as long as we are getting more and more stuff and material living standards are rising, everyone should be satisfied. That's the economy's job. And two, that markets will in fact always deliver best the things that we want. I certainly think conservatives are inclined to a free market point of view, certainly recognizing the limits of government much more than progressives do. But it's not conservative in the Burkean sense, in the small c conservative sense, to have a blind faith that markets will automatically generate these sorts of outcomes. It's not conservative to say, well, all we really want is lots of stuff. That's what human flourishing is about. And then it's not conservative ultimately to say conservatism means this list of 4 policy things in all circumstances.
Yes.
And so that's what American Compass has been pushing back against, trying, in a sense, I would say, to restore a more genuine conservative approach to economics that recognizes that human flourishing, that what we want from well-functioning free markets, yes, is efficiency and lots of stuff, but also the creation of good jobs that ensure that everybody can support a family wherever they are, whatever their aptitudes, and then recognizing that markets aren't always going to do that of their own volition, and that therefore conservative policy needs to be responding to the actual challenges we have in the 2020s, not simply flipping through a 1980s playbook.
I suspect a lot of our listeners and viewers will respond positively to the more textured understanding of the proper goal of public policy that you just set out. But of course, we've just come through a period of high inflation here in Canada and the United States, where we've had, in your case, an election, and we'll have a pending one, where issues around affordability, cost of living will loom pretty large. Are you convinced that Americans and perhaps Canadians are prepared to live with some of the trade-offs as consumers and inherent in your public policy vision?
I think there's a great deal of openness to trade-offs, and And it's important to distinguish them from what we saw with the inflation of recent years, which was just the bad part that, by the way, we were promised would not happen in service to nothing in particular. I think when you actually communicate clearly with people about the trade-offs that have been chosen, that, remember, were presented as not trade-offs at all. These were all just win-wins. We're going to grow the economic pie. Everybody gets more pie. And what could be wrong with it? People are recognizing that, in fact, there's a trade-off associated with that, and one that they do not care for at all. And so I think if you begin from that point of saying, we do have to make choices, we are not happy with the ones we've made, where do we want to change things? I think you actually find a very strong appetite, certainly in the United States, for instance, a recommitment to production and reindustrialization. And certainly in all the survey research that we've done, that holds up even when you present the questions in ways that are sort of very blunt and almost kind of overlean into what the costs of those things are. And the one other thing I'd say is I think it's also useful to communicate in those terms about the policy debates, because one thing that's very interesting that we face right now, for instance, if you talk about tariffs, right, all of the economists show up and say, what are you talking about? This is crazy. Tariffs are horrible and insane, et cetera, et cetera. And it's very important to recognize that they are drawing that conclusion based on the exact same set of models and assumptions that led us down this path. That is, for the most part, they will still say free trade with China was the right choice. It did, in fact, give us more cheap stuff. Like, what's the problem here? And so it is an internally coherent worldview that you either have to accept wholesale or reject wholesale. And saying to people, look, if you are happy with how things have been going, then the economists are absolutely right. If you are not happy with how things have been going, then you have to understand that what the economists are trying to sell you, in essence, is not, in fact, what you want.
You mentioned tariffs. I'd be remiss if I didn't take up the subject, because as you've learned in the past 24 hours, it's something that's loomed large over Canada ever since in late November, President-elect Trump mused about imposing tariffs on Canada. Talk a bit about the role of tariffs in this political economy vision that you've set out. What are their different possible functions, and how should we understand the threat of tariffs on Canada within that framework?
Well, I think it's really important, as you put in the question, to distinguish between the things that tariffs can do. And the most important distinction is, are we talking about essentially economic tariffs, or are we talking about negotiating tariffs? Because, in the context I was just describing, this rethink of political economy, tariffs can play a very effective role in changing those incentives, in putting a thumb on the scale for production and investment of various types. But you also have to recognize that there's a different reason to use tariffs, which is as negotiating leverage, essentially as a tool of statecraft. And I think it's very important to recognize that the tariffs that Trump has threatened countries with, demanding that they respond in various ways, are almost by definition negotiating tariffs. There is no assertion that whether you're talking about the tariffs on Canada and Mexico that were threatened, if you go back a week when he threatened a 25% tariff on Colombia, it would have made no sense to say, well, this 25% tariff on Colombia will not create American jobs. No one said it would. It was intended not to minimize cost to the U.S. or to produce economic benefit, but to maximize cost to a counterparty in pursuit of some different behavior. And certainly in the case of Colombia, it worked. We've seen now in the case of both Canada and Mexico, no tariffs were ultimately imposed to this point. There is a set of demands and things that Trump wants other countries to be doing. And so in that respect, it frankly sits outside the political economy discussion. I do think, on the other hand, it's important to then pull it back in.
Yes.
Because it has incredible implications for, at the broadest level, what folks call the liberal world order. The U.S. has always had the option of using its power in this way, and it has been a conscious choice of U.S. policymakers, really since the end of World War II, certainly in the post-Cold War era, not to. That the assumption was that if the U.S. sort of behaves more in the character of a benevolent hegemon, if it promotes a set of liberal values and relationships, it too will ultimately benefit. And what you see that I think a lot of folks in the U.S., certainly on the right of center, now believe, and Trump especially believes, that has simply not been beneficial. That was perhaps theoretically not a great way to think about things, and certainly empirically has not played out well. And so there's not just a willingness to use a tariff as a tool of force in a sense, where there wouldn't have been previously. There's an eagerness to, because doing so serves the sort of meta purpose of disrupting the status quo and pushing toward a reorganization.
Let's push that line of thinking a bit further, because if that is the underlying impulse behind these threats of tariffs, what's the case for starting with Canada, Mexico, and China? Why not select other countries around the world if the ultimate goal is to precipitate a reconceptualization of the global trading system and America's place in it?
Well, I think, one just descriptive point is that Canada, Mexico, and China are the primary trading partners of the United States. And so it shows a certain willingness and commitment to really go after this in a way that, doing it with Colombia doesn't have the same effect, obviously. I also think there's a clear strategic impulse that you see from Trump on a host of areas to sort of intentionally choose the most radical case in a sense. So to, not sort of marginally push forward, but to say, what is the most extreme version of this that would most dramatically make the point? And in that respect, the very fact that the U.S.-Canada relationship has traditionally been so close and been seen as not a venue for this sort of conflict actually makes it one that can be more appealing.
It demonstrates his commitment to this broader theory of the
That's
case.
right. There are no exceptions, right?
Yes.
And I think we could talk a lot about both the strengths and weaknesses of that approach. There are certainly places where it has served him and the United States quite well. I would say there are times when it has significant drawbacks too. But I think it helps if you work within this, if you start from this framework, the sorts of moves that you see the administration making, I think at least start to make more sense.
One thing that has struck me in our time together over the past couple of days here in Canada is the extent to which you think behind a lot of these moves is a rethinking about the unipolar world and American hegemony. Why don't you talk a bit about how you would connect the dots between what on the face of it looks like international economics on one hand, and in your mind, a broader foreign policy or defense and security play on the other hand?
Yeah, and I think the place to really look at for this is at what the senior advisors in the Trump administration are talking about, writing about. Secretary of State Marco Rubio has begun speaking more about just an acceptance of the reality that we are no longer in a unipolar world, we are in a multipolar world, and the United States therefore needs a strategy for optimizing its outcomes in that totally different context. Stephen Mirren, who is now the chair of the Council of Economic Advisors, recently published a very interesting paper talking about sort of the need to reorder the global economic system. Scott Bessent has spoken in those exact same terms. And I think what you see as the common thread running through that thinking is the idea that, again, if you accept that the liberal world order that sort of envisioned an end of history and an embrace of China and everyone happily, marching forward into the rainbow sunset. I don't know if you can have a rainbow sunset, but you can't have free trade with China either, and we tried that.
Yes.
And so maybe we'll call it the rainbow sunset theory of free trade. If you're not going to have that, the question is, what are you going to have?
Yes.
And I think folks like Rubio and Bessent and Mirren are quite thoughtfully describing that if you are going to have a multipolar world, given the realities and interrelationships between economics and national security, you almost inevitably are going to have trading blocs that are both economic and security in nature. I think it's really important to emphasize that that is sort of the entirety of modern human history, right? That there was never some idea that in the context of a Cold War between the US and the Soviet Union, like, but that's okay, we can still have free trade. It was only at the point where we thought the Cold War was over,
Yes.
we do have one hegemon, everyone is going to become a liberal democracy, that saying, well, let's do free trade with China would ever have been attempted in the first place. And if you accept that we are going to have very different economic and political systems in different parts of the country, or in different parts of the world, where the fundamental interests of those countries, as they define them for themselves, are in conflict and not seen as mutually beneficial, then the model of globalization and free trade and so on just doesn't make sense. There's no reason to believe it should work. And the alternative to that is a model where you say, okay, well, there's probably going to be a U.S.-centric bloc. There's going to be a geographic element to that centered on U.S., Mexico, Canada, Western Hemisphere, where the U.S. is still effectively a hegemon, both economically and militarily. There are going to be other countries that make sense to be part of it and want to be part of it. I would say, Japan, India, UK, Australia. You can start to think about who that is. But that being in that block is going to mean something different than, hooray, we're all in the WTO together.
Yes.
It is going to mean that the U.S. Will assert stronger interests at the expense of other countries. Those countries are likely to chafe greatly at that, but ultimately prefer it to the alternative of being in a China-based bloc, let's say. And the key commitments of being within the bloc are going to be not only that you are allied with each other, but also that you are excluding the other. That is that we all agree we could have low tariff barriers among ourselves, but we are all going to maintain consistent barriers and limit market access vis-a-vis those who are operating under other systems.
What would you say to the argument that you probably will get today at our luncheon, that this ahistoric approach by the administration with respect to its relationships with allies and others may push them out of the American orbit into other arrangements, including, as you mentioned, with China? Why do you think that's not in your mind, persuasive or real threat?
Well, I think for other market democracies, it's important to distinguish the sort of emotional reaction from the cold, hard calculus.
Yes.
And I think certainly in the short run, you will see many emotional reactions. I think if you try to step back and not from either the U.S. or Canadian perspective, but as a neutral analyst of the options available to a country like Canada, and you ask how much worse would the U.S. have to treat Canada
Yes.
before Canada would actually rationally prefer to be in a China-dominated bloc?
Yes.
I think the answer is there's an enormous amount of room there. And that's not to say the U.S. should or it would be in the U.S. interest to push up to that line.
Yes.
But it is to say that the U.S. standing so far away from the line and essentially having said we will not use the kind of leverage that we have has some room to go there. And I think, partly for the political reasons and the initial focus of the Trump administration on immigration, on the border, partly for some of the legal reasons around the emergency that had to be attached to any tariff threat.
Yes.
We saw this initial focus with Canada on border security, on fentanyl, on immigration. I suspect, certainly if I were defining what are the kind of the long-term areas where there's probably going to have to be some reordering of the relationship, things that are going to end up at the top of the agenda are defense spending and commitments. And we've started talking a little bit about what does Canada bring to that relationship. It's not necessarily troops, right? There are other forms of contribution in national security that might make sense. I think actually the drug pricing issue is an enormous one that is gaining salience in the U.S. and the extent to which the U.S. system, at very high cost to itself, subsidizes access to leading medical innovations in the rest of the developed world.
Yes.
I think is a major issue. And I think the last one is just on the natural resources front. I think that's a place where there's obviously very high levels of opportunity for mutually beneficial agreement, but that from the U.S. perspective, having strong commitments that it is the U.S. and the U.S.-centered bloc that is the beneficiary of Canada's natural resources will probably be something that's quite important to the U.S.
We had several policymakers at our event last night in Ottawa. We have policymakers who regularly listen to the podcast. If they've been persuaded by what you've just set out, first, that the administration envisions scrambling longstanding assumptions about political economy and America's economic relationship with allies and others around the world, and second, that it is reconceptualizing its policy in a world of multipolarity, not unipolarity, and that means focusing on its hemisphere and on its region. What are the implications for Canadian policymakers? What does that mean for the way it interacts with the United States and the strategy it brings to the table in the lead up to impending renegotiation of USMCA?
Well, I think there's sort of there's in the negative and in the positive.
Yes.
And I think in the negative, it's probably just very important in the short term to not overreact. It's been interesting to hear folks sort of start talking about, well, here's our leverage and here's what we can do to the U.S. and so forth. And, or maybe we will go back and rethink our China relationship. And I think the reality, and, I could be wrong, but my interpretation is that that's just not that credible in practice. And that at the end of the day, it doesn't actually serve anybody on the Canadian side or obviously the American side to sort of respond to what are actually quite credible and well backed up threats with totally non-credible escalations.
Yes.
And so, I do think that in the short term, that's worth keeping in mind. I think the bigger step on the sort of more positive side is, I think the faster that other countries choose to accept rather than resist this shift, the less time we will spend in the costly disruptive phase and the more time we can spend in the actually there's plenty of value and mutual benefit phase. And, one will only agree with that if you agree with me about what the ultimate status quo is. If you say, that's ridiculous, we are still, we are going to get a new WTO agreement or yes. I don't know. I don't even know how to tell that story. But if certainly there's no shortage of center-left economists out there still kind of spinning their narrative about what we could be doing instead. I guess one model for it would be, what you saw from the Biden administration with what they called their small yard, high fence model, which was the idea that we could define a very small set of high-value defense technologies that we were going to keep away from China.
Yes. And
other than that, we could still have a wonderful, flourishing relationship and collaborate on pandemic response. And off it goes into the ether from there. So you have to agree with the premise. But if you agree with my premise about where we're headed, then I think there's a lot of opportunity for any of the U.S. allies to move, what are the 5 stages of denial, or,
yes.
To move out of the anger phase and actually get out ahead of helping to define what that could look like. So I think, Trump is the quintessential negotiator and deal maker. And typically I think it's actually there's one school of negotiation that says don't disclose anything and make the other person make their offer first, so whatever. I think that is a quite foolish model of negotiation. I think you're actually always much better off starting with a constructive proposal in the frame that you want to be in. And so I think if countries, whether it is Canada or the UK or Japan, accept where we are headed and can start from that position of saying, yes, we accept where we are headed, and we therefore propose X as what that could look like. Here are things that we can do on defense, on healthcare, on critical minerals and other natural resources. In Canada's case, that we actually think would be the basis for a new agreement. I think that does two things. One is, again, I think it just moves us out of the phase that's going to be costly to everybody more quickly. And two, I think that's where you actually do start to create some leverage, because as compared to that, there are plenty of worse outcomes. And so actually defining, hey, here are things that could be on the table that you do care about, let's go in that direction, I think is just a much better way to move forward. But there are big political challenges, obviously, in a domestic political context to taking what I would say is a non-emotional approach to the situation.
Yeah, there's so much I could ask or say in response, but I'm sensitive of time, and so I'll leave those questions and comments maybe for the luncheon that we're heading to shortly. But I want to wrap up, Oren, with where we started. You at American Compass have been making what amounts to an intra-conservative case for a reconceptualization of political economy. And there is some evidence, as we've been discussing today, that the Trump administration has taken up some of the assumptions and prescriptions of the work that you're doing. But of course, Trump himself has only a single term left. Make the case that there is a growing constituency that will succeed Trump, that has come to imbue the political economy assumptions of American Compass. In other words, what's the evidence that you are competing and even winning the argument on the American right with respect to these issues?
Well, I think to start by not providing the evidence, I think it's important to recognize Trump himself as a quite transitional figure in all of this. I think there are ways that, certainly he has very much disrupted the status quo ante. There are ways which I think his instincts on some of these issues are very good. But there are also a lot of ways in which, his agenda and priorities, people would point to and say, well, that's not what American Compass is talking about at all. And I would say, I don't disagree. But I think there certainly is a lot of opportunity for progress in the short run. I think you do start to see that just shifting of the playing field in a way that I think is needed. And then where I think you can be especially optimistic looking out to the medium term is at more broadly the trajectory of the conservative movement, of the Republican Party. One place you see this is just in all of Trump's appointments. And certainly in the kind of political economy related roles that we're talking about here, you could pick any given one and say like, oh, but he says this or he says that. But if you compare to the 2016 equivalent, yes, I think you can say that in fact every single one is significantly improved from my perspective in terms of moving further in this direction. And in a lot of, obviously the distance from Mike Pence to J.D. Vance is maybe the most obvious. I mean, the distance from Rex Tillerson to Marco Rubio is
on these issues
is no less significant. Going from a Kevin Hassett to a Stephen Miran as the chief economic advisor, et cetera. And you see these in contexts we haven't talked about as much here, but on labor, moving to a Secretary of Labor actively supported by the Teamsters Union, yes, moving to people in competition and antitrust who are probably closer to Lena Khan than they are to traditional Republican appointees. So I think you see it shifting there. I think you see it shifting in, by implication, who is the next generation of Republican leaders. If you look at, okay, who is the most likely set of candidates in 2028. If you look at who's coming into the Senate now, it is all in this direction. And then if you look behind that at sort of the broader conservative ecosystem, the next generation of, lawyers and writers and researchers and policy staff, they are even more overwhelmingly oriented in this direction. And so, to some extent at this point, I would say it is almost baked in. I mean, obviously, things can always change, but almost aside from whether or not we are right, and to be clear, we are right, but aside from whether or not we are right, the, in a sense, almost demographic trend dictates that this is what the American right of center is increasingly going to be looking like and talking about. And I think we're very fortunate to have a set of folks like Rubio and Vance, like Josh Hawley, Tom Cotton in the Senate, folks coming into the Senate like Dave McCormick, Bernie Moreno, who aren't just sort of talking the talk because they feel the wind's shifting, but actually have been thinking about and talking about this stuff already and really believe it, and I think can be a very good set of leaders on it.
Yeah, well, we have to wrap up here. There's so much to talk about. I want to thank you for joining us here in Canada and joining us on Hub Dialogues. Oren Cass, the founder and chief economist at American Compass. It's been great talking to you.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you.